Let's take a look at how images are used on the web. Web pages can contain many kinds of content, but one of the most common types of content is the simple image. Let's explore some of the most common file formats used on the web. It's important to remember that while this list is far from complete, there are many formats that aren't supported by web browsers at all. So it's a good idea to stick to these for most purposes. First up is the very common JPEG format, sometimes written with an E. JPEG is a full-color bitmap format, which means it's made up of a grid of individual pixels, each of which has its own color value. And basically, any color can be used. When enough of these pixels are put together and made small enough, the eye blends them together in an image. This makes them great for photos and other images with a lot of fine details. While they're great for fine details, it's important to remember that the larger the image and the greater the detail, the larger the image file size. That's because you end up with a lot of individual pixels. And all those pixels can lead to slow page loading on the web. Another important limitation to keep in mind is that JPEGs don't support transparency, so you'll never be able to see through any part of the image to the background. Next, let's look at the PNG format. It's also a bitmap format, but it's mostly good for simple graphic shapes, and it does support transparency, so it can be really useful when you need to be able to see through empty areas of the image to the background. While PNG does support full color like JPEG, it doesn't offer the same kind of compression, so it isn't the best choice for photos or images with fine details because the file sizes can become too large. Next, GIF is a bitmap format as well, but unlike JPEG and PNG, GIFs use a maximum of 256 colors, making it only suitable for graphics with simple shapes and colors. Despite this limitation, they still tend to result in fairly large files. Like PNGs, GIFs do support transparency, but the results are generally less smooth. So if GIFs have so many limitations, why do people still use them? The answer is animation. The GIF format allows the simple looping frame animations commonly used for internet memes. While all the previous formats are bitmap and use grids of individual pixels, SVGs work in a completely different way. They are vector graphics, which use a series of points and curves to define shapes, kind of like a fancy mathematical game of connect the dots. Because of this, they can be scaled up indefinitely without any loss of quality or pixelization. And they support transparency. You can also edit the raw code of an SVG, which means you can do fancy things on a website, like style their individual parts, or even animate them directly with CSS. You can use this to achieve some pretty cool effects. Now that we've talked about what kind of images can be used on a web page, let's turn our attention to how to use them on a web page. The most common way to use an image in HTML is to use the image element. Basically, this element references a specific image file and tells the browser, "Hey, show this image." The tag for this element uses the abbreviation IMG. Note that this is a self-closing HTML tag and doesn't require a separate closing tag. The source attribute on the image tag indicates which image file to use. It contains a file path that shows where the file is located, including any folders or subfolders in which it's placed. Every image tag should also include the alt attribute, which contains text to be used as an alternative if the image fails to load or if the user is browsing with a screen reader for the visually impaired. Finally, there's also an optional title attribute for text that will show when a mouse hovers over the image. The use case for this is pretty rare, and it shouldn't be considered an alternative to the alt attribute, which is required for accessibility. For SVGs, you can use the regular image element we just discussed, but you can also paste the code of an SVG directly into an HTML file. This is useful if you want to use CSS to directly manipulate different parts of the image. To review, there are a number of image file formats that can be used on websites, including JPEG, which is good for photos and other high-detail images, PNG, which supports transparency and is good for simple, low-detail images, GIF, which supports limited color but is useful for looping animations, and SVG, which is infinitely scalable and can be altered with CSS. And to use an image in HTML, you can use the image element, which uses the source attribute to tell the browser which image file to show and where the file is located. It also uses the alt attribute to provide descriptive text and can optionally use the title attribute to show text on mouse over. Finally, SVG images can also be shown by directly adding the SVG code to the document HTML. We call this inline SVG, and it allows direct CSS control of the different parts of the image.